When the convention came into being in 1972, how we as a world community perceived heritage, and also being an initiative which to a large extent also had quite a lot of European countries behind it, with perhaps a more traditional mindset when it comes to what is heritage, that the focus to a large extent was on tangible heritage, monuments, and you see over the years that there is this strong need to also identify some intangible elements or associated values to certain sites. We call it sites, but whether it's a monument or even a natural site, is that these values, they need to be recognized because they give meaning to a certain place or to a certain object. And that is something that you see as a very clear development when they set the criteria. And then at one point there was the criteria of associated values that was added, but also the idea of a cultural landscape, which came in the 1990s. And that idea of a cultural landscape, which is, just not a very, just a clear object or a clear, very strict boundary, but it's also something which is, the interaction between human and its environment. So there's a recognition of those elements. So the idea of a historic urban landscape. So, you have inner cities, and in these inner cities there's a lot of dynamic elements. So how do you have them incorporated in such a convention? What is important to note is that in addition to the World Heritage Convention, there's also an intangible heritage convention. And this convention, which was established in 2003, was also clearly something that had a lot of support from countries in which the notion of heritage was much more intangible focused rather than tangible focus, which is in the World Heritage Convention at first the case. And this convention can be seen as a clear development also within the scope of UNESCO to identify or recognize that heritage is not just something that you can touch. It's also something that is there for its meaning and for the communities that are actually passing on or embodying the heritage. If you look at the World Heritage site, there are quite some sites in which you would think that the tangible elements are the outstanding universal value. For example, there's a site in Japan. In the site, it's a mountain that they have recognized as a World Heritage site. And you might think that it's because of its natural values, but it's actually because it has been an inspiration or a source of inspiration to a lot of artists and poets. And therefore, it was actually inscribed for its cultural values. And I think that there are quite some sites, also if you look at Iceland, for example, Thingvellir, it's, you would think that it was inscribed for its natural values because if you're there, you can actually see it's a beautiful